Health Research, the Medical Research Council, and they'll start using it as well. But I just wanted to make a really important distinction between this concept of involvement and integration and participation in research. It's really important that the participation in research are the people who give the data. And many of you are giving data to the bioscience project and other things. Involvement is this active partnership in research. You're equal partners with the academics, with the clinical researchers, with the statisticians, etc. And that's what this should be about. So what I want to do is very briefly say something about why is there all this interest in patient involvement and public involvement in research. Then I want to say something about the kinds of impacts that research has shown it can have, and particularly for patients, service users, or the public who get involved. And then I want to talk a bit about one of the key challenges. I think you need to be really aware this is a very tricky area if you do try to integrate into research teams. You need to be on your mettle, you need to be really assertive, and you need to be with colleagues. Don't ever go into one of these committees on your own. It's not a good idea, right? So let me start with a joke, really. This is a joke that comes from my work with communities, really, but it's very relevant to people with particular health conditions, service users. We have this peculiar thing in England. When we're in a recession, we don't give poor people more money to live on. What we do is teach them how to use their money better. And the usual way of doing it is cooking classes. Yes. So this is a cooking class. This was produced for me by an artist in Glasgow when I was telling the joke. And this lady is teaching these women living in poverty how to cook cod's head soup. Now, you wouldn't do that now because cod's very expensive. So let's call it fish head soup, all right? And at the end, this lady says, has anybody got any questions? You can see the lady in the middle say, I've got a question. What's the question? While we're eating the head, who's eating the fish? Right? For me, think about it. There's a very political point there. This lady understands the inequalities in power, and that's the kind of environment you're going into. The clinicians, the researchers, the statisticians, they're the ones with the power, not the patients, not the service users. But it's also an incredibly wise comment. So the primary purpose for getting patients, service users in the room, involved, integrated in research is because of your wisdom, because of the experiential knowledge that you have. Right? There are lots of other reasons. Researchers will ask you to get involved because the funders require them to do it, right? Don't be conned. The National Institute for Health Research particularly won't fund research unless you've got patients or service users or public involved. So that's a key reason. They'll do it because they think it's going to improve their science, really important, make it more relevant, make it more better able to be taken up, all of those reasons. So there are lots of different reasons. So why should you get involved? Well, the research I've done suggests that people with a particular health condition, using particular services, living in poverty, living in rubbish housing, they want to get involved because of altruism, because they want to help other people who are living in those conditions. So altruism is a really powerful motive for the public to become integrated in research. But it's also self-interest. You want to know more about your condition. You want to know more about how to manage it. And it can be empowering, but I'll come back to that. So, what do we know about the impacts of public involvement in research? What can it have? This is the public as supposed partners on committees, right? Well, there's a lot of research evaluating impact. This was done about 4 years ago. I'm sure there's a lot more now. And in total, we found 215 different types of impacts of having the public as partners, inverted commas, in your research, right? The majority of these were positive impacts. But look at this, around a third are negative impacts. And a lot of research evaluating the impact doesn't look for negative impacts. I'll say a bit more about that soon, right? And these impacts were on the research, but also importantly on the people who get involved in research. I've got my phone because of the time. I talk too much. I'm looking at the time. So let me just look very quickly at the positive and negative impacts on the public that get involved, on patients, service users, etc. So the positives, maybe they're obvious, but people report often increased knowledge. Knowledge about their condition, knowledge that helps them to manage their condition, knowledge that is valuable to them and to others, to their families, to their friends. They report developing new skills, computer skills, team working, research skills, learning how to do interviews. Sue, incredible, getting her own research grant. You know, these are very powerful skills, writing skills, that can be used and are used to get better jobs, better employment. I know a lot of members of the public who've been involved in my research who've gone on and got jobs when they didn't have them before because of the skills they've got by being involved in my research. And they get personal benefits, so feeling valued, feeling empowered, greater self-confidence, more friendships, yes, becoming more assertive, all of those things. And sometimes you might get financial rewards. If you're involved in National Institute for Health Research, you'll get a fee for being involved, as well as travel expenses. The negatives are the mirror images of all of those things, right? So personally, people report being frustrated at not being listened to. I think that's more about not being heard. I think sometimes researchers try to listen, but they don't hear what's being said, right? They're marginalized in teams, in these committees. Often there's one person on that committee rather than 2 or 3, dominated by academics and clinical researchers who don't even know that they're using positional power. They're not even aware of the power they have in those environments. They're not valued, they're intimidated. Inadequate training, very little training provided or not the right kind of training, not even clear what your role is. You don't get a role description. The other people have a job description. You don't get a role description. Practically, it can be difficult to travel. Anybody who's on welfare benefits will know that getting this fee can be a real nightmare, no? So they might offer you a payment, but you can't take the payment without affecting your benefits. Universities are absolute rubbish at paying fees. I know that. It takes me months to get my public partners paid. Little fees, you know, let alone travel expenses. And the people I work with are all living in really difficult socioeconomic circumstances. Very heavy workload. Often the academics and the clinical researchers don't appreciate that giving you 20, 30 pages to read is a lot of work, right? And then financial, actually it can be a financial burden, but also it can be a time burden. So these negative impacts are significant, and the majority of the studies we looked at didn't even look for them, right? So it was I can't remember the phrase now, it's not evidence of absence, right? Because they hadn't looked for them. It was absence of evidence. So out of all of that, colleagues and I did a research about maybe 7 or 8 years ago, and we came up with this idea of a tokenism cycle in public involvement. And updating this more recently, this is still quite common, right? What happens here is that public involvement is undervalued. Remember, a lot of researchers do it because they have to do it, because they won't get the grant if they don't do it. And, you know, the people I've met here, the researchers I've met here, have the best of intentions. They sound great, right? I'm sure they're not doing this intentionally if they are doing it, but it's not always explicit and intentional. So you start off with it not being sufficiently valued, or, really importantly, different values for doing it in the team that are not made explicit, right? And that leads to tokenism. So, as has already been said, you might be asked to help design the patient information leaflet. You might be asked to help to look at the questions that are on the questionnaire. Very rarely, you're asked to identify the research questions. Very rarely, you are asked to be partners on research applications, right? So you're very rarely involved at the beginning of a research process where you prioritize issues and decide. You're often involved a bit later on. So that kind of tokenism, that you're not equal partners, your experiential knowledge is not heard, or it's considered to be very interesting but not quite directly relevant, then that tokenism fails to demonstrate value, right? And if you fail to demonstrate value, then the involvement is perceived as not adding value, so it's undervalued. And this is happening all the time in applied health research. Now, your field might be different, but just be aware. You need to be aware. You need to be constantly questioning. As you've been asked, you do need to be very assertive and unafraid of asking questions and challenging. So how can tokenism be avoided? We spoke to about 300 patients, public, clinicians, academics, and the two things they said to us, those that were interested, said, we need some standards. We need some very clear standards for integration/involvement. And they also said we need time to think about these issues. So now, the National Institute for Health Research has published national standards for public involvement. You need to integrate these into this initiative. You need to look at those standards and say, how do we use these standards as an organization to make sure that our members are being treated as equally as possible in this process. And then we've also produced this thing called the Public Involvement Impact Assessment Framework, which is for teams to surface these issues about values and impacts and methods, and then to design the kind of assessment of impacts you want. So I won't go into that in any detail, but I'm going to end now. So my conclusion here, this is another little joke. You didn't laugh at the first one, so you probably won't laugh at this one. So, you know, I think the problem with public integration and public involvement, I think the problem is the enthusiasm, right? Because what the enthusiasm does is you're looking at the big things, the big questions, the big issues, and you're not looking at the detail. This road sign was genuinely on the road in South Australia, honestly. It's typically Australian. So you're going past and you're laughing. You know, this sign has sharp edges. Isn't that funny? Ha, ha, ha. Don't touch the sign. Right at the bottom, if you look, it says also, the bridge ahead is down. So the key message, you've missed it. You've gone past the sign and you've missed it, and you're in the water. So I think, don't be enthusiastic, but don't let it distract you from looking at the detail, looking at power, challenging how you put yourself in positions as service users and patients to be equal in this collaboration. So public involvement can improve quality, relevance, and utility. It can build your knowledge, your skills, your confidence. It can support dialogues about the management of ill health, but the positive benefits depend on removing inequalities in knowledge. So your knowledge is equal but different, and it will not be treated like that. It will absolutely not be treated like that in most encounters you have with researchers, even though they talk the talk, right? Giving public real influence throughout the research project from the beginning, before the questions are set. Making values explicit and managing them. So the patient might want to be involved because it's their right to be involved. It's a democratic right, it's public money, you should be involved. The researchers might want you involved because it will improve the science. There's a lot of potential for conflict, right? And then you need to make sure the processes are fit for purpose and well-resourced. And then you need to measure impacts, but you must look for the negatives as well as the positives. Thank you.
Thank you to all our speakers who've been set up for the day. My name is Nicola Fernhead, and I'm welcoming you here on behalf of CCUK, ACPGBI, BDRF, and all the others at the bottom there. It occurred to me in listening to those three talks, you might like to very quickly know about how we selected the studies that are being presented today. Every single one of them has gone through a pretty rigorous process in terms of what they've sent to us. One of those things was that there was patient involvement in the concept and design. We have turned down studies that did not have that, and we've also turned down studies who did not answer the fundamental question, are you prepared, on the basis of what you hear at this meeting, to change anything and everything in your study on the basis of what we hear from you today? So I just wanted to give you that little bit of reassurance to know that that is already on. We will make some of the mistakes that are there, but I'd like you to start out today in a really positive mood to allow us to get the best from you. And if there are problems or things arise, then terms of patient representation and support, we have CCUK representatives in every room, and if you have any problems contacting anybody, then go through Sue, Caps, or Mark. I hope you have a fantastic day today, and I think we're about set to go first one up. Caps, do you want to introduce Miles?